Good evening, and welcome to Footnotes and Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and this is part 23 of Flavius Josephus's Wars of the Jews. We have reached Book 5. Vespasian, raised to the purple, has gone to take up the empire at Rome, and has left his son Titus to finish the war and reduce the Holy City. We give it complete, in plain modern English, in William Whiston's grand old public domain translation. The plain rendering, and the muttering, are my own. As Titus marches up to Jerusalem at the head of his legions, he finds the city already destroying itself. 3 rival tyrants, Simon son of Juras, John of Chala, and Eleazar, waging a savage civil war in its very streets, and in their madness burning the great stores of grain that might have fed the city through a siege. Let us begin.
When Titus had marched across the desert between Egypt and Syria, as has already been described, he came to Caesarea. He had decided to arrange his forces there before beginning the war. While he had been helping his father at Alexandria to settle the government that God had lately given them, the sedition in Jerusalem flared up again. It split into 3 factions, and each faction fought the others. In such evil circumstances, even this division may be called a good thing, and an effect of divine justice. The attack that the Zealots made on the people, which I consider the beginning of the city's destruction, has already been explained carefully, how it began and how far the mischief grew. But the present sedition could rightly be called a sedition born from another sedition, like a wild beast driven mad, which, when it lacked food from outside, turned to eating its own flesh. Eleazar, the son of Simon, had first separated the Zealots from the people, and made them withdraw into the temple. He seemed greatly angered by the insolent acts that John committed every day against the people, for John never stopped murdering. The truth, however, was that Eleazar could not bear to submit to a tyrant who had risen up after him. Wanting to gain the whole power and rule for himself, he revolted from John. He brought over to his side Judas, the son of Chelcias, and Simon the son of Ezron, both men of very great influence. He was also joined by Hezekiah, the son of Chobar, a man of high standing. Each of these men was followed by many zealots. They seized the inner court of the temple, and laid their arms upon the holy gates, and over the holy fronts of that court. Because they had plenty of provisions, they were confident. There was a great abundance of things consecrated for sacred uses, and they had no scruple about using them. Yet they were afraid because their numbers were small, and after storing their arms there, they did not move from the place they held. John had an advantage over Eleazar in the number of his followers, but he had an equal disadvantage in his position, because his enemies were above him. He could not assault them without fear, but his anger was too great to let them remain at rest. Although he suffered more harm from Eleazar and his party than he could inflict on them, he still would not stop attacking them. There were continual sallies on both sides, and darts were constantly thrown from one group to the other, so that the temple was everywhere defiled with murders. Meanwhile Simon, the son of Juras, the tyrant whom the people had invited in because they hoped he would help them in their great distress, held the upper city and a large part of the lower city. He now made more violent attacks on John and his party, because they were also being attacked from above. Yet Simon, when he attacked them, was below their position, just as John was below the attacks of those above him. In this way John both received and inflicted great damage with ease, because he was fought from both sides. The same advantage that Eleazar and his men had over John because they were above him, John had over Simon because he stood above Simon. For this reason John easily repelled the attacks made from below with weapons thrown by hand, but he had to repel those who threw darts from the temple above him by using engines of war. He had many engines that threw darts, javelins, and stones. With these he not only defended himself against those who fought him, but also killed many of the priests while they were carrying out their sacred ministries. Although these men were mad with every kind of impiety, they still admitted those who wished to offer sacrifices. They searched the people of their own country beforehand, suspecting and watching them closely. They were less afraid of strangers, who, cruel as the factions were, had obtained permission to enter that court, yet even these strangers were often destroyed by the sedition. The darts thrown by the engines came with such force that they passed over all the buildings, reached as far as the altar and the temple itself, and fell upon the priests and those attending to the sacred offices. Many people had come with great zeal from the ends of the earth to offer sacrifices at that celebrated place, which was regarded as holy by all mankind. These people fell down before their own sacrifices and sprinkled with their own blood that altar which was held venerable among Greeks and barbarians alike. The bodies of strangers were mingled with the bodies of their own countrymen, and the bodies of profane persons with those of the priests. The blood of all kinds of corpses stood in pools in the holy courts themselves. O most wretched city, what misery so great as this did you ever suffer from the Romans when they came to cleanse you from your hatred within? You could no longer be a place fit for God, nor could you long continue to exist, after you had become a tomb for the bodies of your own people, and had made the holy house itself a burial place in your civil war. Yet may you grow better again, if perhaps hereafter you appease the anger of that God who is the author of your destruction. But I must restrain these emotions by the rules of history. This is not the proper time for private lamentations, but for historical narration. I therefore return to the actions that followed in this sedition. There were now 3 treacherous factions in the city, each separated from the others. Eleazar and his party, who held the sacred first fruits, came against John when they were drunk. Those with John plundered the common people and went out fiercely against Simon. Simon obtained his provisions from the city in opposition to the seditious. When John was attacked from both sides, he made his men turn about. From the cloisters that he controlled, he threw darts at the citizens who came up against him, while with his engines of war he opposed those who attacked him from the temple. Whenever he was free from those above him, which happened often because they became drunk and tired, he sallied out in great numbers against Simon and his party. He always did this in whatever parts of the city he could reach, until he set fire to the houses that were full of grain and all other provisions. Simon did the same thing when John withdrew, and he attacked the city in turn. It was as if they had deliberately acted in the service of the Romans, destroying what the city had stored up for the siege and cutting through the very sinews of their own strength. So it happened that all the places around the temple were burned down and became an open wasteland between the opposing sides, ready for fighting from both directions. Almost all the grain was burned, though it would have been enough for a siege lasting many years. Thus the city was taken by famine, which would have been impossible if they had not prepared the way for it by this conduct. As the city was caught in war on every side by these treacherous crowds of wicked men, the people of the city between them were like a great body torn to pieces. The old men and the women were so distressed by their internal calamities that they wished for the Romans and earnestly hoped for an outside war to deliver them from their miseries at home. The citizens themselves were seized with terrible alarm and fear. They had no chance to take counsel or change their conduct. They had no hope of making peace with their enemies, and those who wished to flee could not do so, for guards were set in every place. The leaders of the robbers, though they were divided by sedition against one another in other matters, agreed in killing those who favored peace with the Romans, or who were even suspected of wanting to desert to them, as their common enemies. They agreed in nothing except killing the innocent. The noise of those who fought went on without interruption by day and by night. Yet the lamentations of those who mourned were louder still. There was never any occasion for them to stop lamenting, because one calamity followed another without pause. Even so, the deep terror they were in held back their outward wailing. Forced by fear to conceal their inward emotions, they were tormented within, not daring to open their lips in groans. No regard was paid by relatives to those still alive, and no care was taken to bury the dead. The reason for both was that everyone despaired for himself. Those who were not among the seditious had little desire for anything, since they expected with certainty that they would very soon be destroyed. As for the seditious themselves, they fought one another while trampling on the dead bodies that lay heaped together. From the corpses under their feet they seemed to take up a mad rage and became even fiercer. They were always devising some new harm against themselves, and once they had decided on anything, they carried it out without mercy, omitting no method of torment or barbarity. John even abused the sacred materials and used them for constructing his engines of war. The people and the priests had previously decided to support the temple and raise the holy house 20 cubits higher. King Agrippa, at very great expense, and with very great labor, had brought their materials suitable for that purpose, pieces of timber remarkable to look at, both for their straightness and for their size. But the war came on and interrupted the work. John had those timbers cut and prepared for building towers, because he found them long enough to use against the enemies who fought him from the temple above. He had the towers brought and set up behind the inner court, opposite the west end of the cloisters, which was the only place where he could erect them. On the other sides of that court there were so many steps that they could not be brought close enough to the cloisters. In this way John hoped to overpower his enemies by engines built through impiety. But God himself showed that John's labor would be of no use to him, by bringing the Romans against him before he had raised any of his towers. Titus gathered part of his forces around him, ordered the rest to meet him at Jerusalem, and marched out of Caesarea. He had with him the 3 legions that had accompanied his father when he laid Judea waste, together with the 12th legion, which had formerly been beaten with Cestius. That legion was already notable for its valor, and now marched with still greater eagerness to avenge itself on the Jews, remembering what it had previously suffered from them. Of these legions, Titus ordered the 5th to meet him by going through Emmaus, and the 10th to go up by Jericho. He himself moved with the rest. Besides them marched the auxiliaries sent by the kings, now more numerous than before, along with a considerable number who came to help him from Syria. Those soldiers who had been selected from the 4 legions and sent with Mucianus to Italy had their places filled by soldiers who came out of Egypt with Titus, 2,000 men chosen from the armies at Alexandria. 3,000 more followed him from those who guarded the river Euphrates. Tiberius Alexander also came with him, a friend most valuable to Titus both for his goodwill and for his prudence. He had formerly been governor of Alexandria, but was now considered worthy to be general of the army under Titus. The reason was that he had been the first, very recently, to encourage Vespasian to accept his new dominion, and had joined himself to him with great fidelity while events were still uncertain and fortune had not yet declared for him. He also followed Titus as a counselor, very useful in this war because of his age and his skill in such affairs. As Titus marched into the enemy's country, the auxiliaries sent by the kings went first, together with all the other auxiliary forces. After them came the men assigned to prepare the roads and measure out the camp. Then came the commander's baggage, followed by the other soldiers, fully armed, who were there to support it. Titus himself came next, with another chosen body of troops around him. After him came the pikemen, and after them the cavalry belonging to that legion. All these went before the engines. Behind the engines came the tribunes and the leaders of the cohorts with their chosen bodies. After them came the standards, with the eagle, and before the standards came the trumpeters attached to them. Next came the main body of the army in their ranks, each rank 6 men deep. The servants belonging to each legion followed them, and before these servants went their baggage. The mercenaries came last, and the men who guarded them brought up the rear. Titus, following Roman custom, went in the front of the army in proper order. He marched through Samaria to Gophena, a city that had formerly been taken by his father and was then held by a Roman garrison. After staying there one night, he marched on the next morning. When he had gone about a day's march, he pitched his camp in the valley which the Jews, in their own language, call the Valley of Thorns, near a village called Gabaothseth, meaning the Hill of Saul. This place was about 30 furlongs from Jerusalem. There he chose 600 select horsemen, and went out to view the city, to observe how strong it was and how courageous the Jews were. He wanted to see whether they would be frightened and submit when they saw him, before any direct battle began. He had been told what was in fact true, that the people who had fallen under the power of the seditious men and robbers greatly desired peace, but were too weak to rise against the rest and so remained quiet. As long as Titus rode along the straight road that led to the city wall, no one appeared outside the gates. But when he left that road, turned toward the tower Cephanus, and led the band of horsemen on a slanting course, an immense number of Jews suddenly leaped out near the towers called the Women's Towers, through the gate opposite the monuments of Queen Helena. They cut off his cavalry, stood directly opposite those who were still running along the road, and prevented them from joining the men who had turned aside. They also cut off Titus, with only a few others. At that point it was impossible for him to go forward, because the whole area had trenches dug from the wall to protect the gardens around it, and was full of gardens lying at angles and of many hedges. He also saw that it was impossible to return to his own men, because of the multitude of enemies between them. Many of his own men did not even know that their commander was in danger, but supposed he was still among them. Titus understood that his safety had to depend entirely on his own courage. He turned his horse around, cried out loudly to those around him to follow, and charged violently into the middle of his enemies, intending to force his way through them back to his own men. From this we may especially learn that both the success of wars and the dangers in which kings are placed are under the providence of God. A great number of darts were thrown at Titus while he had neither helmet nor breastplate, for, as I have said, he had gone out not to fight but to inspect the city. Yet none of them touched his body. They passed aside without harming him, as if every dart missed him deliberately and only made a sound as it went by. Titus kept turning aside with his sword those who came at him from the flank. He overthrew many who met him directly, and made his horse ride over those who had fallen. The enemy shouted at Caesar's boldness and urged one another to rush upon him. Yet the men against whom he charged fled away from him in great numbers. Those who were in the same danger with him stayed close beside him, though they were wounded on their backs and sides, because each of them had only one hope of escape. They had to help Titus open a way for himself before he was surrounded by the enemy. 2 of the men with him were at some distance. The enemy surrounded one of them and killed both him and his horse with darts. The other they killed as he leaped down from his horse, and they carried the horse away with them. But Titus escaped with the rest and came safely to the camp. The success of this first Jewish attack raised their spirits and gave them an unfounded hope. This brief turn of fortune in their favor made them very confident for what followed. That night the legion that had been at Emmaus joined Caesar. At daybreak he moved from there and came to a place called Scopus. From this point the city could already be seen, and there was a clear view of the great temple. This place lay on the north side of the city, adjoining it, and was a plain. It was very properly named Scopus, or the Prospect, and was no more than 7 furlongs away from Jerusalem. Here Titus ordered a camp to be fortified for 2 legions together. He also ordered another camp to be fortified 3 furlongs farther behind them for the 5th legion. He thought that, after marching in the night, those men might be tired and deserved to be shielded from the enemy, so that they could fortify themselves with less fear. As these men began to build, the 10th legion, which had come through Jericho, had already reached the place where a certain armed party had formerly been stationed to guard that pass into the city, before it was taken by Vespasian. These legions had orders to encamp 6 furlongs from Jerusalem, on the mountain called the Mount of Olives. This mountain lies opposite the city on the east side, and is separated from it by a deep valley between them, called Cedron. Until then the several parties inside the city had been continually clashing with one another. His foreign war, suddenly and violently coming upon them, gave the first check to their quarrels with each other. When the seditious men saw with astonishment that the Romans were pitching 3 separate camps, they began to think of a strange kind of agreement among themselves. What are we doing, and what do we mean by allowing 3 fortified walls to be built around us, shutting us in so that we will not be able to breathe freely? The enemy is safely building a kind of city against us, while we sit still inside our own walls and merely watch what they are doing, our hands idle and our armor laid aside, as if they were working for our good and advantage. It seems we are courageous only against ourselves, while the Romans are likely to take the city without bloodshed because of our sedition." After encouraging one another in this way, they gathered together, immediately took up their armor, ran out against the 10th Legion, and fell upon the Romans with great eagerness and a tremendous shout while they were fortifying their camp. The Romans were scattered into different groups to carry out their various tasks, and for that reason many had laid aside their arms. They had thought the Jews would not dare to make a sally against them, and that even if the Jews were inclined to do so, their sedition would distract them. So the Romans were unexpectedly thrown into disorder. Some left the work they were doing and immediately marched off, while many ran to their arms but were struck and killed before they could turn back against the enemy. The Jews grew more and more numerous, encouraged by the success of those who first attacked. While their fortune remained good, they seemed both to themselves and to the enemy to be many more than they really were. Their disorderly style of fighting at first stunned the Romans, who were constantly used to fighting skillfully, in good order, keeping their ranks and obeying commands. For this reason the Romans were caught off guard and forced to give way before the assaults made on them. When some Romans were overtaken and turned back upon the Jews, they stopped their advance. Yet because the Romans did not protect themselves carefully enough in the heat of pursuit, they were wounded by them. As still more Jews sallied out of the city, the Romans were at last thrown into confusion, put to flight, and driven from their camp. It even seemed that the entire legion might be in danger, if Titus had not been informed of their condition and immediately sent help. He reproached them for cowardice, brought back those who were running away, and himself fell upon the flank of the Jews with the chosen troops who were with him. He killed a considerable number, wounded more, put them all to flight, and made them run hastily down the valley. The Jews suffered greatly on the slope of the valley, but when they had crossed it, they turned around, stood opposite the Romans with the valley between them, and fought there. The battle continued until noon. A little after noon, Titus placed the troops who had come with him to assist the Romans, together with those belonging to the cohorts, in position to prevent the Jews from making any more sallies. Then he sent the rest of the legion to the upper part of the mountain to fortify their camp. This movement of the Romans seemed to the Jews to be a flight. The watchman posted on the wall gave a signal by shaking his garment, and a fresh multitude of Jews came out with such mighty force that one might compare them to the rush of the most terrible wild beasts. In truth, none of those who opposed them could withstand the fury of their attack. As if they had been shot from an engine, they broke the enemy ranks apart. The Romans were put to flight and ran away toward the mountain, leaving only Titus himself and a few others with him in the middle of the slope. These few, who were his friends, despised the danger they were in and were ashamed to leave their general. They earnestly urged him to give way before these Jews who were so eager to die, and not to run into such dangers before men whose duty it was to stand in front of him. They urged him to consider his fortune, and not, by taking the place of an ordinary soldier, suddenly risk turning back against the enemy. He was the general in the war and lord of the habitable earth, and all public affairs depended on his preservation. Titus, however, seemed not even to hear these persuasions. He opposed those who ran upon him, struck them in the face, and when he had forced them back, killed them. He also fell upon great numbers as they marched down the hill and drove them forward. They were so amazed by his courage and strength that they could not flee straight to the city, but turned aside from him on both sides and pressed after those who were fleeing up the hill. Still he attacked their flank and checked their fury. Meanwhile disorder and terror again fell upon those who were fortifying their camp at the top of the hill when they saw the men below them running away. The whole legion was scattered, because they thought the sallies of the Jews were plainly irresistible, and that Titus himself had been put to flight. They took it for granted that if he had stayed, the rest would never have fled. A kind of panic fear surrounded them on every side. Some scattered one way and some another, until certain men saw their general in the very middle of the action. Greatly concerned for him, they loudly proclaimed to the whole legion the danger he was in. Shame now made the soldiers turn back, and they reproached one another for doing worse than running away, because they were deserting Caesar. They then used their utmost force against the Jews. Moving away from the straight descent, they drove them in heaps down to the bottom of the valley. The Jews turned and fought them, but they themselves were now retreating. Because the Romans had the advantage of the ground, and were above the Jews, they drove them all into the valley. Titus also pressed hard on those who were near him. He sent the legion once more to fortify their camp, while he and the men who had been with him before stood against the enemy and prevented them from doing further harm. So, if I may be allowed neither to add anything out of flattery nor to diminish anything out of envy, but to speak the plain truth, Caesar twice delivered that entire legion when it was in danger, and gave them a peaceful opportunity to fortify their camp. When the fighting outside the city paused for a while, the sedition inside Jerusalem flared up again. The feast of unleavened bread had now arrived, on the 14th day of the month Xanthicus, which is Nisan, the day on which the Jews believed they were first freed from the Egyptians. Eleazar and his party opened the gates of the innermost court of the temple, and admitted those of the people who wished to worship God there. But John used the festival as a cover for his treacherous plans. He armed the least notable men of his own party, most of whom had not been purified, hiding weapons under their garments, and sent them eagerly into the temple in order to seize it. Once these armed men had entered, they threw off their garments and immediately appeared in armor. A very great disorder and disturbance then arose around the holy house. The people who had no part in the sedition supposed that the attack was being made against everyone without distinction, while the zealots thought it was aimed only at themselves. So the zealots stopped guarding the gates, jumped down from their battlements before any battle began, and fled into the underground caverns of the temple. Meanwhile, the people who stood trembling at the altar and around the holy house were rolled together in heaps, trampled underfoot, and beaten without mercy with both wooden and iron weapons. Men who had private quarrels also killed many quiet people out of personal hatred and enmity, pretending that they were enemies of the seditious. All who had formerly offended any of these plotters were now recognized and led away to be slaughtered. After they had done abundant horrible harm to the guiltless, they granted a truce to the guilty and let those who came out of the caverns go free. The followers of John now seized the inner temple and all the engines of war in it, and then dared to oppose Simon. In this way the sedition, which had been divided into 3 factions, was reduced to 2. Titus intended to pitch his camp nearer to the city than Scopus. He placed as many of his chosen horsemen and footmen as he thought sufficient opposite the Jews to prevent them from sallying out, while he ordered the whole army to level the distance all the way to the city wall. So they tore down all the hedges and walls that the inhabitants had built around their gardens and groves of trees. They cut down all the fruit trees between them and the city wall, filled up all the hollow places and chasms, and demolished the rocky precipices with iron tools. By this work they made the whole area level from Scopus to Herod's monuments, which adjoined the pool called the Serpent's Pool. At this very time the Jews devised the following trick against the Romans. The boldest of the seditious men went out near the towers called the Women's Towers, pretending that those who favored peace had driven them out of the city. They wandered about as if they were afraid of being attacked by the Romans and also afraid of one another. Meanwhile those standing on the wall, pretending to be on the people's side, cried out loudly for peace. They begged that their lives be secured, called for the Romans, and promised to open the gates to them. As they cried out in this way, they threw stones at their own people, as though trying to drive them away from the gates. Those outside also pretended that they had been forced out, and that they were begging the men inside to let them back in. They continually rushed violently toward the Romans, then returned and seemed to be in great disorder. The Roman soldiers believed this cunning trick was real. They thought one party was already in their power and could be punished as they pleased, and they hoped that the other party would open the gates to them. So they set about carrying out their plan. Titus himself, however, suspected the surprising behavior of the Jews. Only the day before, he had invited them through Josephus to come to terms of agreement, and they had given him no civil answer. Therefore he ordered the soldiers to stay where they were. Nevertheless, some of those stationed at the front of the works acted ahead of him. They caught up their arms and ran to the gates. At first, those who seemed to have been driven out withdrew. But as soon as the soldiers came between the towers on either side of the gate, the Jews ran out, surrounded them, and fell upon them from behind. At the same time, the multitude standing on the wall threw down a mass of stones and darts of every kind. They killed a considerable number and wounded many more. It was not easy for the Romans to escape, because those behind them pressed them forward. Besides this, the shame they felt for having been deceived, and their fear of their commanders, made them persist in their mistake. So they fought for a long time with their spears and received many blows from the Jews, though they gave back just as many. At last they drove off those who had surrounded them. As the Romans retreated, the Jews pursued them, following and throwing darts at them as far as the monuments of Queen Helena. After this the Jews, without showing any restraint, became insolent because of their good fortune. They mocked the Romans for having been deceived by their trick. They beat their shields noisily, leaped for joy, and shouted in triumph. The soldiers, however, were received with threats by their officers and with indignation by Caesar himself. These Jews, who are guided only by their madness, nevertheless do everything with care and caution. They devise stratagems and set ambushes, and fortune gives success to their stratagems because they obey, and because they preserve goodwill and fidelity toward one another. But the Romans, to whom fortune is usually subject because of their good order and ready submission to commanders, have now failed by behaving in the opposite way. As they could not restrain their hands from action, they have been caught. And what is most disgraceful of all, they went forward without their commanders, in Caesar's very presence. Truly, the laws of war must groan heavily, and so will my father himself when he is told of this wound that has been given us. He has grown old in wars, and yet never made so great a mistake. Our laws of war always inflict capital punishment on those who break good order, even in the smallest degree, while now they have seen an entire army run into disorder. However, those who have been so insolent shall immediately be made to understand that even men who conquer among the Romans, if they fight without orders, fall under disgrace. When Titus had spoken at length about this before the commanders, it was clear that he intended to execute the law against all who had been involved. The soldiers' spirits sank into despair, since they expected to be put to death, and to be put to death justly and quickly. But the other legions gathered around Titus and pleaded for favor toward their fellow soldiers. They begged him to pardon the rashness of a few for the sake of the better obedience of all the rest, and promised on their behalf that they would make amends for their present fault by more virtuous conduct in the future. Caesar yielded both to their requests and to what prudence suggested. He thought it proper to punish individual offenders by actual executions, but that the punishment of great multitudes should go no further than reproofs. So he was reconciled to the soldiers, but gave them a special charge to act more wisely in the future. He also considered how he might repay the Jews for their stratagem. The space between the Romans and the wall had now been leveled, a task completed in 4 days. Titus wanted to bring the army's baggage and the rest of the multitude that followed him safely to the camp. Therefore he set the strongest part of his army opposite the wall on the north side of the city and opposite its western part. He formed his army 7 ranks deep, with the footmen placed in front and the horsemen behind them, the horsemen arranged in 3 ranks. The archers stood in the middle in 7 ranks. With so great a body of men blocking them, the Jews were prevented from making sallies against the Romans. The beasts that carried the burdens belonging to the 3 legions, along with the rest of the multitude, then marched on without fear. Titus himself was about 2 furlongs from the wall, at the part where it formed a corner, opposite the tower called Cephanus. At that tower the circuit of the northern wall bent and extended toward the west. The other part of the army fortified itself at the tower called Hippicus, likewise 2 furlongs from the city. The 10th legion, however, continued in its own place on the Mount of Olives.
And there we will pause, with the Romans encamped before the walls and the factions still cutting each other's throats inside them. Next time, in part 24, Josephus halts the action to show us the city itself, its 3 great walls and towers, and the dazzling marble and gold wonder of the temple before the siege engines come up against them. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.